I'll be fine, Kendra, I promise. Kendra stood by the door of McKay's hospital room, and she instantly felt the air charge around her. Fear replaced relief. He smiled, and Kendra felt the fear blossom inside of her. McKay's arms opened to her, and she quickly grabbed the invitation. She gently placed her tote bag on a table, then hurried forward, burying her face in his familiar chest. Memories flooded her as she breathed in his scent that was slowly getting overwhelmed by the dreary smell of sickness. She felt tears rushing to her eyes, threatening to fall, and it was all she could do to fight them back. There was a baby to think about now. She took in a breath meant to fortify her, but it only pushed in more of the dark scent that seemed to billow around her sick boyfriend now. What would she do about the baby? How would McKay react, knowing that he was inches away from death and she was hosting a baby, his baby, inside of her? Finally, the tears did fall onto McKay's chest as she thought of raising the child alone 7 months from now. Her boyfriend would be long gone by then, crushed permanently under the colon cancer that was eating away at him. Pulling on all the strength she had left, she moved away from him and folded her arms against her chest. "I'm sorry about the tears. I won't make it a habit." He smiled. "Promise me that anytime you need someone to lean on, you'll call me." Kendra snorted, wiping away her tears with the back of her hand. "If anyone here needs leaning on, it's you." McKay rolled his eyes, even though the movement appeared sluggish. "I am fine, Kendra." She sighed, evading his statement. What did the doctor say, then? She watched him swallow hard. "The doctor said my next chemo session is coming up on Friday. We'd need to pay for that as soon as possible." His voice trailed off meaningfully. Kendra nodded. "I'll source for the money, my love. You do not have to worry at all." "How will you find the money?" McKay asked. His voice sounded even more broken than ever. Kendra managed to summon up a smile that didn't reach her heart. She made a show of tucking his blanket around his body, fighting off a fresh wave of tears that burned the back of her eyes. "I will," she started, "probably take another loan. I am sure the hospital can spare another one for me. After all, I have been working with them for years now." "Is it that easy?" he asked, his icy blue eyes darkening with apprehension. "You owe them what, $15,000 already?" Kendra said nothing, only busied herself with her boyfriend's blanket. She did not want him to see the look of despair and hopelessness that had settled in her eyes, did not want him to worry as much as he was currently doing. She leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to McKay's forehead, her lips lingering for a moment before she pulled away. "I love you, McKay," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "And you do not have to worry about the money. I will do everything I can to make sure I find the money and get you through this successfully." McKay managed a weak smile, his eyes reflecting both gratitude and resignation. "I know you will, Kendra," he replied softly. "Hell, I do not deserve you." Those tears threatened to spill from Kendra's eyes again, but she blinked them back, forcing herself to stay strong for McKay. She straightened up and smoothed down the wrinkles in his blanket, tucking it snugly around him once more. As she turned to leave, a sudden impulse seized her, and she hesitated by the door. Should she tell him about the baby now? It felt like the right moment, a moment of truth, and perhaps a bit of vulnerability between the both of them, but a voice inside her warned against it, urging her to wait for a better time. He might not be able to handle the news, knowing fully well that he might not live to see his child. She did not want to make him more miserable than he already was. Taking a deep breath, Kendra pushed the thought aside and plastered on a smile. "I'll see you soon, okay?" she said, her voice cheerful but tinged with sadness. McKay nodded, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. "Yeah, soon," he murmured, his gaze following her as she walked out of the room. Alone in the hallway, Kendra leaned against the wall, the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. She felt torn between the overwhelming urge to confide in McKay and the fear of burdening him with more worry. With a heavy heart, Kendra made her way to the hospital's front office, her mind racing with thoughts of how to come up with the money for McKay's next chemo session. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she was determined to do whatever it took to ensure his treatment continued. Irene, the front office nurse, gave her a bright smile as she walked in. Kendra was a regular face in the hospital, partly because she worked there herself. "Kendra," Irene called out. "It's been a hot while." Kendra wanted to inform the woman that she was here just yesterday, but kept shut. She had other pressing matters to attend to. Plastering a smile on her face, she replied, "Oh, there's work, and McKay." Irene nodded vigorously. Of course. I can't blame you after all. Who else to take care of him other than you, his girlfriend after all?" Placing a hand on Kendra's shoulder, Irene continued, "By the way, you look like death. Watching over your sick boyfriend doesn't mean you shouldn't take care of yourself, "I am aware, Irene." Kendra sighed irritably. "But all of that is not why I am here." Irene's gray eyes narrowed, and she jerked her hand away as though Kendra's shoulder was a cactus. "What is it then?" "May you send a message to Dr. Turner?" Kendra asked. "I'll write a note." "Sure." Irene fished for a notepad from her drawer, alongside a pen, and tore a leaf from it. She pushed it across the counter towards Kendra. Silently, Kendra scribbled a quick note to Dr. Turner. She signed it off, folded the note, and gave it back to Irene. "Tell him to call me the moment he gets this." "Of course," Irene chirped. Without another word, Kendra walked away with her tote bag over her shoulder. A few meters away, she turned to see Irene reading her note with a disdainful wrinkle of her nose, oblivious to the fact that Kendra had caught her in the act. Kendra felt her skin crawl with fury, but she kept silent and walked away. All for McKay, she thought. This was all for McKay. Hours later, she sat at her desk in the hospital's pediatric unit where she worked, poring over financial reports and brainstorming fundraising ideas. Despite her exhaustion, she refused to give up hope. Suddenly, her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. She picked up the phone and saw that it was Dr. Turner, McKay's oncologist. With bated breath, Kendra picked the call. "Hello, Dr. Turner." "Miss Clinton," Dr. Turner replied in his deep Southern accent. "I got your message from Irene. How are you doing today?" "I am very well, Dr. Turner, thanks." Kendra rubbed a sweaty palm against her thigh. Did you read the entire note?" I did. There was a pause on the other end, short but ominous, and Kendra felt her hope plummet for a moment. However, she remained positive. "And what do you think?" she prompted. "I do not think that would be possible, Miss Clinton." Kendra's heart sank as the oncologist's words hit her like a punch to the gut. She had been hoping against hope that she could secure another loan to cover McKay's next chemo session, but now her worst fears were coming true. "Why?" she asked, her voice as hoarse as ever. "I'm sorry, Miss Clinton," the oncologist said, his voice filled with regret. "But there's simply no more loans available for you. You're already owing a substantial amount, and the hospital can't extend any more credit at this time." Kendra felt her chest tighten with panic. But I need this loan," she pleaded, desperation creeping into her voice. "McKay's next chemo session is crucial. He won't survive without it. You know this, Dr. Turner." The oncologist sighed, and Kendra could tell that he genuinely felt sympathy for her. But sympathy and pity would not help her, and it certainly would not pay for McKay's chemotherapy. "I understand your situation, Miss Clinton, but there's nothing more I can do. We've already stretched our resources to the limit, and we can't risk financial instability for the hospital." Tears welled up in Kendra's eyes as she struggled to process the devastating news. She had been counting on this loan to keep McKay's treatment going, to give him the fighting chance he deserved. Now it seemed like all her efforts were in vain. "But there must be something I can do," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I'll do anything to save McKay. Anything. What if I work extra hours at the hospital? Extra shifts, I mean." "Miss Clinton, you are already working way too much for one person," Dr. Turner replied patiently. "We cannot possibly give you any more shifts." The oncologist paused for a moment, before speaking again. "I wish there was a way I could help you, Miss Clinton, but I'm afraid the situation is out of my hands. Perhaps you could explore other options, like crowdfunding or reaching out to charitable organizations. But as far as the hospital's finances go, there's no more room for negotiation." Feeling defeated and hopeless, Kendra nodded numbly and cut the call. Her head found the top of her desk, and the first sob slipped from her lips. Dear God, what was she to do? The subway was much cheaper than putting gas in her car, so Kendra was stuck jostling for a seat in it with a dozen different people. Cursing colorfully under her breath, she clutched her tote bag to her chest, away from any potential muggers or pickpockets. Tucking a strand of dark brown hair behind her ear, she craned her neck, searching for the damned subway train. As the honk of the subway train echoed through the crowded station, Kendra's heart jumped with anticipation. She knew she had to fight her way to the front if she had any hope of securing a seat on the packed train. With determination etched on her face, she pushed through the throng of people, her tote bag clutched tightly to her chest. The chaos of the station engulfed her, bodies pressing in on all sides as commuters jostled for position. Kendra was tossed to and fro like a leaf in a storm, her hair flying wildly around her face as she struggled to keep her footing. "Hey, watch it!" a plus-sized woman shouted and pushed a man who was standing beside her. Another person grabbed hold of Kendra's hair from behind, yanking her backward with a sharp tug. "Move it, lady!" Kendra gritted her teeth against the pain, her hands tightening around her tote bag as she fought to regain her balance. But before she could recover, another person shoved her from the side, sending her sprawling to the ground with a cry of surprise. For a moment, Kendra was surrounded by a sea of legs and feet, the weight of bodies pressing down on her from all sides. She tried to push herself up, but the crush of people made it impossible for her to stand. "Hey, watch where you're going!" she heard someone yell, their voice tinged with annoyance as they kicked out at her. Kendra could not fight the mob. She felt as though she would sink and never get up again. "I can't get up!" Kendra called out, her voice barely audible above the din of the station. "Help, please!" A few sympathetic faces glanced down at her, but nobody stopped to offer assistance. In the chaos of the rush-hour commute, everyone was focused solely on their own destination, oblivious to her plight. Feeling defeated and overwhelmed, Kendra sank back onto the cold, dirty subway tile floor, her heart heavy with all her tears shed and unshed. Tears stung her eyes as she watched the subway train pull away, leaving her stranded on the platform. A few minutes passed, and she struggled to her feet, fighting back her tears and anger. Why did this have to happen to her today, of all days? "Ma'am?" Kendra swiveled so hard that she almost tumbled backwards, and her eyes fell on a man that stood before her. His mismatched choice of clothing slightly startled Kendra, and she narrowed her eyes in suspicion. He had a dirty, oversized trench coat, and underneath that, a lemon-green shirt, which was unbuttoned at the collar. A paisley-patterned blue tie sat askew against his chest, and he wore leather sandals. Despite his funny-looking state, the man's piercing blue eyes held an odd warmth that seemed to heavily contrast the overwhelming energy of everything else around her. His hand was outstretched, and in it was her wallet. "You dropped this when you fell." Hastily, Kendra grabbed the wallet and threw it into her tote bag, muttering a, "Thank you so much," under her breath. The man parted his lips to speak again, when a loud, "Hey!" jolted him from behind. The man turned, only to let out a string of colorful profanities. Kendra glanced over his shoulder and saw a group of 4 men walking towards them. Kendra noticed a strange, pointy thing sticking out from under one of the men's shirts. As she took a closer look, she realized it looked like a knife holster. "Who are they?" she asked. Silence answered her. The man stumbled forward to meet the armed men. "Guys, it is nothing, I assure you. I was only—" The leader of the gang shut the man up with an elbow against his face. With a yelp of pain, he fell to the ground, gripping his face. "I guess the last punishment wasn't enough, huh?" The leader snarled as they all formed a circle around the writhing man on the ground. "What did we say about unnecessary niceties, old man?" This was starting to get out of hand, Kendra thought. She glanced around wildly, hoping against hope that help would turn up. However, they were the only people present at the subway station. These armed men could easily overpower her, and nobody would be able to help. In a sudden surge of courage, Kendra stepped forward, waving her hand in the air. "Stop!" The men froze, and their leader turned to her. One glance at his hardened face, and the courage died in Kendra's throat. "This is all I got in my wallet. Please take it and leave him alone," Kendra pleaded, holding a wad of cash that she ripped out from her wallet. "You—" The leader snarled and took several menacing steps towards her, then stopped. Turning to the old man on the ground, he wagged a warning finger. "Watch your back, old man," he growled. "Watch it!" Kendra waited until the scary men were gone before rushing to the man's aid. She helped him to his feet, offering him a handkerchief to wipe off the dust on his body. "Thanks," the man muttered, grateful. "You didn't have to, but thanks." "Are you okay?" she asked. He shrugged. "As long as I stay away from the subway for the next few weeks, I will be. Rocco might be vicious, but he has a short memory. Rest assured, he'll forget about all of this soon." The man's formal vocabulary slightly awed Kendra. There was none of the grit that came with the New York accent in his tone. She guessed that there was more to this man than met his eye. "You helped me with my wallet and got beaten up for it," she replied. "I should thank you instead." The man nodded, his expression serious. Together they made their way to a bench on the platform where they could wait for the next subway train in relative peace. Kendra felt the man's gaze lingering on her, and she couldn't shake the sense of unease that prickled at the back of her mind. Clutching her tote bag even tighter, she warily met his eyes, searching for any hint of deception or malice. But to her surprise, all she found was kindness and genuine interest reflected in his gaze. When the man spoke, his voice was gentle and compassionate. "Be careful during rush hours. You didn't fall accidentally. That's how they try to knock off anything that's in your pockets when they fail to pick them." The man wiped his face more. Then he looked at Kendra and asked, "And I couldn't help but notice that you were upset earlier, before I gave you your wallet." He started, genuine worry filling his voice. Kendra's heart skipped a beat, and her defenses instinctively went up. She was alone in a subway station with a male stranger. Who knew what he could do to her if she wasn't careful enough? She hesitated, unsure if she should trust this stranger with her innermost thoughts and fears. But there was something about the sincerity in his eyes that made her want to open up. "I'm fine," she replied curtly, her voice tight with apprehension. "I am fine, really." The man shrugged, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. "That's fair enough," he said, his tone light. "Just thought I'd ask. After all, I'm just a stranger in a subway station. Your secrets are safe with me." Kendra bit her lip, torn between her natural inclination to keep her guard up and the nagging feeling that this man genuinely cared about her well-being. Finally, she made a decision. "My boyfriend had cancer," she explained, then quickly corrected herself. "Has cancer, I mean... A few years back, we were living our lives, just like any other couple. At first, we thought it was just a stomach bug or something, but when the symptoms persisted, we knew something wasn't right." The man nodded, encouraging her to continue. So, we went to see the gastroenterologist in the hospital where I work, and after a series of tests, they convinced us it was definitely not just a stomach bug. They convinced us to go to the oncologist, who finally gave us the dreaded news. Kendra continued, her voice tinged with sadness. Colon cancer. Oh! The man's expression softened, his eyes filled with empathy. It hit us like a ton of bricks, Kendra went on, her voice trembling with emotion. He was always so strong and healthy, and to see him so vulnerable, it broke my heart. The man reached out and tentatively squeezed Kendra's hand in silent solidarity. She was tempted to pull away, but left her hand in the warmth of his touch. We tried everything, Kendra said, her voice growing hoarse with emotion. Chemotherapy, radiation, surgery, but the cancer just kept coming back. And now we're facing another round of chemo, and I don't know how we're going to pay for it. Tears welled up in Kendra's eyes as she spoke, the weight of her burden feeling heavier than ever. The man listened quietly, not interrupting her, even as she ranted away. When she was done, he reached out into his coat pocket and pulled out a packet of wipes. Opening it, he handed her one. A pretty lady like you should not be caught in tears, you know, he said. Kendra snorted, a bitter edge to her laughter. Oh, I've had my fair share of tears, sir, especially from my family. She paused, her gaze distant as she delved into her past. My father was one of the richest men in New York, and my mother, well, she was many things. An award-winning actress, a retired model, an eccentric woman, a terrible mother. Anyway, they wanted me to follow in my mother's footsteps, to become a renowned model like she was. They said I had the looks for it. A bitter smile touched Kendra's lips. But I was always too bookish for that. I wanted to pursue medicine, to make a real difference in the world, you know. To be judged not only for my looks, but for what I had up there. She gestured to her head. I saw how fame and fortune had gotten into my parents' heads, how it had made them conceited and shallow. I didn't want to be like them. After college, they stopped sponsoring my education, Kendra continued, her voice tinged with sadness. They all but disowned me when I refused to bend to their will. They said I was a disappointment, that I had brought shame upon our family name. The height of it all came when I decided to date McKay, Kendra went on, her voice growing stronger with conviction. Instead of the rich mogul's son they'd tried to match me with. He was just as nasty and bourgeoisie as my parents had been, and I would have died than marry him. I loved and still love McKay with all my heart, and nothing they said could make me believe otherwise. Kendra's eyes flashed with defiance as she spoke. So they threw me out of their lives, disowning me and cutting me off from their wealth and influence. Until I bring home a suitor worthy of their respect, I'll have no claim to their empire. In other words, I won't be their heir until I marry someone rich enough to meet their standards. The man listened in silence, his expression a mixture of sympathy and admiration. McKay, he's a lucky man to have you by his side. The man sighed, slipping his hands into his coat pockets as he spoke. I had a girlfriend when I was 20 years old. She was the most wonderful woman I'd ever met. She was like a breath of fresh air to the stifling mess that was my life then, until she got pregnant, and I became stupid. I claimed that the baby wasn't mine, even though I knew deep down that it was. You could say I was scared of the responsibility that came with fathering a child, but the bottom line was that I was stupid. Elaine left me after she delivered our boy, and I never saw her again. I'm 45 now, and I don't even know where my son is. I'm so sorry, Kendra said softly, her voice filled with compassion. That must have been incredibly difficult for you. The man nodded, his expression heavy with remorse. It's a mistake I'll regret for the rest of my life, he admitted. I've spent years searching for my son, hoping for some kind of redemption. But so far, I've come up empty-handed. Kendra reached out and squeezed the man's hand in silent solidarity. I can't imagine how hard that must be. she whispered. The man smiled sadly, a wistful glimmer in his eyes. It's a burden I'll carry with me until the day I die. For a moment, there was silence between them as they each came to terms with their own regrets and sorrows. Then, the man spoke again, his tone gentle but firm. "But you, Kendra," he said, his gaze locking with hers. "At least you didn't make the same mistake I did. You chose love over wealth and status, and for that, you should be proud." Tears welled up in Kendra's eyes at his words, her heart swelling with gratitude. She had never felt so seen and understood by a stranger before, and it touched her in a way she couldn't fully articulate. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The man nodded. He opened his mouth to speak again, and was promptly shut up by the rumble of another subway train. Kendra and the man exchanged a quick glance before moving forward eagerly with the rest of the crowd. They pushed their way through the throng of people, their eyes fixed on the approaching train. But as the train pulled up to the platform, Kendra felt herself being swept along by the crowd, carried further and further away from the man. Panic surged within her as she realized she was being separated from her newfound companion. Frantically, Kendra turned to look back, her heart sinking as she saw the man standing at the very end of the crowd, a small figure amidst the sea of people. "Wait!" she called out, her voice lost in the clamor of the station. "Wait! Come!" The man turned to look at her, a bemused smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Don't worry about me," he called back, his voice barely audible over the noise. "I'll catch the next one." Kendra hesitated, torn between her desire to stay with the man and her need to catch the train before it departed. With a heavy heart, she reluctantly stepped onto the train, watching helplessly as the doors slid shut behind her, separating her from the man who had shown her kindness in her time of need. As the train pulled away from the platform, Kendra pressed her hand against the window, watching as the man faded into the distance. "I caught a subway train again this morning, without incident, thank God," Kendra said after a mouthful of Dunkin' Donuts. "I still have not recovered from the last one. I still have bruises on the back of my thighs. Mira." Mira wiped a smudge of foamy milk from her upper lip. As much as she understood Kendra's refusal to drive her car to and from work to save gas money, she knew there was a part of her friend that thought she should just power through it and use her car like any other upper-middle-class New Yorker. "Don't let anyone tell you you're not a brave woman," Mira told her, between a mouthful of liquid. "I would never take the subway, even on a fat bet. I really am a brave woman. You and your rundown 2006 Prius could never." But Kendra said it with a smile and looked down at Mira's daughter, who was in a carrier beside her. Little baby Annette was another reason Mira would never do something as rugged and risky as catching a quick subway train. Kendra reached out and pulled Annette from the carrier, balancing her against her chest. Annette was the softest thing ever. Her wispy blonde hair tickled Kendra's cheek as she held her close, sniffing in her powdery baby scent. As a nurse, Kendra held babies almost every other day, but it never felt like this. Annette seemed magical, and a dull ache deep in her own belly reminded her that in the next 6 to 7 months, she would also be holding her own bundle of wispy hair and chubby limbs in her hands. Without McKay, the thought depressed her so much that Mira must have noticed it. As though reading her mind, her friend asked, "And what about your subway savior? Seen him since then?" "No, Mira." Kendra sighed. "I would have loved to see him one last time, at least to say a proper thank you. He took blows for me, you know." "I am sure." Mira crossed her legs across the small cafe table, watching Kendra with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "You already look like a mama with Annette," she remarked, her voice soft with contemplation. Kendra offered a small smile in response, her gaze drifting to the tabletop for a moment before meeting Mira's eyes. "The benefit of working with babies all day, I guess," she replied casually, though a twinge of regret flickered within her. There was a brief pause, and Kendra realized that Mira could sense her unease even better than she herself could hide it. "You're not fine, Kendra. I can see it in your eyes." "I don't know how you do it," Mira whispered, her voice tinged with awe and worry. The sentence echoed in Kendra's mind, a recurring theme in her life lately. It seemed to boggle her friend over and over again that she had made the decision to keep McKay alive on her meager four-figure nurse's salary and several loans. She could sense the question Mira was refraining from asking. Why didn't Kendra reach out to her parents to help her and McKay? Surely their massive estate could let go of a few $100,000 to make sure their daughter's boyfriend was well again. Kendra offered Mira her usual refrain of "someone needs to," then added, "and I'm good at it." "I bet you are," Mira murmured, her expression thoughtful as she processed Kendra's words. Mira would never understand the kind of disdain the Clinton power couple harbored for their daughter, their own blood. "Distract me," Kendra said suddenly. The half-bitten donut stopped halfway to Mira's mouth. "What?" "I hate feeling so blue. I need a distraction." Kendra leaned forward, with her elbows on the slightly damp table surface. "Tell me about your job." So as Mira talked, Kendra tried to absorb as much of her voice as she could. Inadvertently, her nose pulled in the scent of donut and iced coffee. Her ears the sound of chatter moving beneath the bustle of the customers, the rumble of the subway train some 2 miles from where they sat. When Mira bent down to pull out her buzzing phone from her bag, Kendra let her eyes wander around, scanning the other occupants of the donut shop. She saw the buxom lady who chattered loudly on her phone a few booths away. She glimpsed the mother of 3, who was 4 booths away, trying hard to calm her bawling toddler. And she saw the man as well. His hair was auburn and wavy, just as Kendra remembered. It was thick and messy, speckled with a few strands of gray, and falling over the tops of his ears. His collar was up in the air, and he was as scruffy as she remembered. His shirt tails were untucked from a pair of worn black jeans. A well-used messenger bag was slung across one shoulder and rested against the opposite hip. He still had the dirty brown trench coat, but this time it was draped over his arm. He ditched the sandals for a worn-out pair of white dunks. With his back to Kendra, he almost looked like 1,000 other men in Brooklyn, but she knew exactly which man this is. Her subway savior. Her hands gripped the edge of the table almost convulsively, and her eyes widened. "Mira!" she called out. Mira hastily cut the call when she saw the mortified look on Kendra's face. "What is it?" she asked. "What did you see?" Kendra wordlessly pointed towards the man, who had picked up his order and was moving towards the entrance now. Mira immediately knew who it was. No words needed. "Call him over before you lose him," she whispered furiously. Kendra shot up from her chair and waylaid the man before he could reach the glass doors. She saw the wary look in his eyes as he did a double take. Then his eyes narrowed and widened almost immediately. "Hey." "Hello, good afternoon." He smiled, and something about him struck her as familiar once more. "I am the subway woman," she said. "Do you remember me?" Of course, I remember you." He chuckled and offered his hand for a handshake. "It's nice to see you again." "So, what's your name?" she asked, flashing him a friendly smile. "I didn't catch it when we met." "Oh, you can call me Tim," he replied, returning her smile with warmth. His voice held a hint of amusement, as if he found the exchange amusingly straightforward. "Nice to meet you, Tim. I'm Kendra." She introduced herself, her tone cheerful and welcoming. "And thank you again, for the help at the subway station." "Likewise, Kendra," Tim responded, his tone genial. "You helped me too, remember. I will be forever grateful." "Have you seen Rocco since then?" she asked. Tim shrugged, balancing his pack of Dunkin' Donuts on his arm. "I have managed to steer clear of him, thank God. That day made me realize that I wasn't going to get a second chance." He smiled sadly. "When you told me your story, and the way you fought on your own to give your boyfriend a chance at life again, it made me realize a lot of things. You're an inspiration, Kendra, and if I can repay you in any way, I would definitely do it." As Tim spoke, Kendra's mind suddenly sparked with an idea. It felt as though the world had stopped around her, as though nothing else mattered but this plan taking shape in her head. She found herself gazing at Tim, wondering if he might be the perfect fit for her plan. He was a bit too old for her, but he would do. In that moment of realization, Kendra's heart raced with excitement. "Wait for me!" she snapped, cutting Tim off mid-sentence. "There is a way you can pay me back." "There is?" Tim asked, interest sparking in his eyes. "Mention it, and it's done." Hurriedly, Kendra made her way back to where Mira sat, her thoughts racing with the newfound inspiration. Sitting down beside her friend, she couldn't contain her excitement any longer. "Mira, I just had the most amazing idea!" Kendra exclaimed, barely able to contain her enthusiasm. Mira looked at her friend with curiosity. "What is it?" Kendra hesitated, a grin spreading across her face. "I'll tell you later," she teased, unable to resist keeping her idea a secret for just a little while longer. With a quick kiss on Annette's cheek, Kendra dashed back to where Tim patiently waited, her mind buzzing with anticipation. "Whoa there!" Tim exclaimed, keeping her at arm's length as she almost ran into him. "What's the hurry?" Kendra stopped before Tim, panting slightly. The anticipation of her idea was buzzing between them like electricity, and she couldn't help but feel a rush of excitement. With a hopeful smile, she turned to Tim. "Hey, Tim, if it won't be a bother, would you mind helping me make some extra money?" Kendra asked, her voice tinged with eagerness. "It's just for one night, I promise. After this, consider the debt fully paid." Tim's eyebrows lifted in surprise, but he nodded. "Sure, I don't mind. If it's legitimate, that is." A grin spread across Kendra's face. "Great! How do you feel about being my +1 to a soiree?" she asked, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Tim's expression fell for a moment. "What is this about?" Kendra stilled her racing heart long enough to reply. "My parents will be hosting a soiree tonight. I heard of it, but, of course, I wasn't invited. I cannot believe it didn't come to mind all this while—" He frowned, as though to ask why she wasn't invited to her family's function. But a meaningful raise of her brows immediately reminded him of the story she told him in the subway the other day. "Well, it sounds like fun. I'm in," Tim said with a nod. With a burst of energy, Kendra reached out to grab Tim's arm, ready to whisk him away on their adventure. But before she could take a step, Tim gently stopped her, his hand resting on her arm. "Hold up," he said with a chuckle, amusement dancing in his eyes. "Where exactly are we going?" Kendra paused, momentarily caught off guard by Tim's question. But then she grinned mischievously. "We're going shopping," she declared, her tone filled with excitement. Tim's eyes widened in surprise. "Shopping?" he repeated, sounding both intrigued and amused. She cocked an eyebrow. "Yes, we're going to rent you a tux." 4 hours later, Kendra stood before her floor-length bedroom mirror, staring at the transformed reflection of herself. She nervously tapped her hands against the black satin dress she had on, feeling her mouth turn to bitter ash. A gift from her mother when she was 19, this dress was the only thing she still had that reminded her of home. It was a miracle she could still fit in the dress, too. After all, more than 5 years had passed since she'd left her parents for good. Would her parents believe her lies this time? Would they see through the made-up face and the sparkling jewelry that she had to dig up from her closet and see that their daughter never truly changed? Would they see right through Tim, too? Kendra's hand slipped up to her neck as she toyed with the tiny silver heart necklace that nestled in the crook of her collarbone. In the years since McKay's cancer discovery, she'd lost so much weight that she could no longer keep count. She hoped her parents would not notice it. She replaced the special words over and over again in her head before saying them out loud. "Tim is my husband," she murmured to herself. "He is an investment banker and also a data scientist, and we have been married for a year. I thought that this soiree would be the best time to introduce him to you." And what about McKay? Kendra could really hear her father's voice in her head, asking her that question. She waved her hands airily before the mirror. "McKay? I ditched him years back. He is no good for me, nor good for the life I want to build." The words caught in her throat, even as she spoke them. This, in itself, felt like a severe betrayal to her boyfriend, but Kendra knew she had to do it. She had expended time, energy, and money towards all of McKay's chemo sessions. She was stuck financially with no help from anyone. Mira had done her best by supporting her with tiny checks here and there, but there just was no other way to save McKay's life without doing something drastic, and this, she knew, was severely drastic. If her parents managed to sniff out any kind of lies, she and this whole plan would be damned. All she needed to do was convince her parents that 7 years after being estranged from them, she was now their perfect little version of a good daughter. Pushing the last of those gloomy thoughts out of her head, Kendra hurried to pick up her clutch from where it sat on her bed. Taking one last glance at herself in the mirror, she turned and walked out of her apartment. Kendra fished out her key and inserted it into the lock, turning it securely. She'd told Tim to come around by 8 p.m. It was 1:45 already. The sound of a horn honking behind her made Kendra turn in alarm. Her apartment was 2 stories up, and from that height, she saw a very impressive-looking black Audi parked before the building. Then the driver's door opened, and Tim stepped down. Kendra's lower jaw fell in utter surprise as the man walked to the foot of her apartment staircase, a small smile on his face. "Where did you get an Audi?" she asked. "I was so not expecting that." Tim flicked his collar playfully with both hands. "It just so happens that I own one." "You're joking!" Kendra said amidst laughs. She began to descend the staircase one at a time, staring at Tim with marvel in her eyes. She truly hadn't been expecting him to turn up in such a vehicle. Tim leaned against the Audi, a hint of pride in his smile. "I borrowed this car from a buddy of mine," he started, catching Kendra's curious gaze. "You won't believe this, but like you, he also had a run-in with those subway gangsters a while back." Kendra raised an eyebrow, her interest piqued as she circled the sleek vehicle. "Really? What happened?" Tim nodded. "Yeah, it was pretty rough. They took his grandpa's watch from World War II. Meant a lot to him since it was all he had left of his grandpa. After everything settled down, the guy felt so grateful for the help. He handed me his business card. Turns out, he runs a car dealership." Tim grinned, tapping on the hood of the Audi. "I figured if I was going to borrow a car, why not go with something special? Make a bit of an impression, you know? But I must say, nothing is more unbelievable than you tonight, Miss Clinton," Tim quipped. Kendra laughed again and allowed him to walk her to the car. Graciously, he opened the door of the passenger seat for her, ushering her in with a wave of his arm. Tim went around and got behind the wheel, starting the ignition. As they drove off down the road, Kendra squeezed her eyes and hoped against hope that nothing should go wrong with her plan. The Audi soon arrived at the grand gates of the Clinton mansion. Kendra couldn't help but feel a wave of nostalgia mixed with apprehension as she stared at the place she had called home for almost 2 decades. The wrought iron gates gleamed in the soft glow of the evening sun. As they drove through the gates, Kendra felt a sense of awe washing over her at the sight of the sprawling grounds. Not one thing had changed since she left 7 years ago. Lush green lawns stretched out before them, manicured to perfection, while majestic oak trees lined the path leading up to the main building. The air was filled with the sweet scent of blooming flowers, and the sound of birdsong added to the serene atmosphere. Beside her, Tim let out an exclamation of awe. "Kendra, you told me your parents were rich, but you never mentioned they were this rich." Kendra smiled stiffly, her heart fluttering with a mixture of embarrassment and slight annoyance. "I guess I didn't want to scare you off," she joked, though the truth was far more complicated. Her parents' wealth was a very sore spot for her, even now after she thought they no longer had any power over her. Finally, they reached the front of the mansion, and Tim parked the car with practiced ease. He got out first, then extended a hand to help Kendra down from the passenger seat. She took it gratefully, feeling a rush of warmth at the simple gesture of chivalry. Linking her arm through his, they made their way up the winding path towards the main entrance of the mansion. The evening sun cast long shadows across the pristine grounds, making Kendra feel more apprehensive than calm. "Come on," she murmured to Tim, leading him towards the hall where the soiree was taking place. Kendra knew every nook and cranny of this grand estate like the back of her hand, each corner holding memories both bitter and sweet. Leading Tim through the corridors that seemed never to end, she felt the memories come rushing back. Finally, they arrived at the great hall, located at the heart of the mansion. Kendra murmured a quiet thank you to the butler who ushered them in. The hall was alive with the sound of laughter and conversation, the air buzzing with excitement and anticipation. Kendra could see her parents in the distance, their tall, familiar figures standing out amidst the crowd. Tim's voice broke through her reverie, his curiosity evident as he asked, "Are those your parents?" Kendra nodded, her expression unreadable as she watched her parents bask in the attention of their guests. Yes, she thought, this was what they loved above all else, even their daughter. They loved wealth and prestige, and the respect that came from both. Mr. and Mrs. Clinton would give anything for that. Turning to a passing waiter, Kendra stopped him. "Tell the host and hostess that their daughter is here." Kendra felt the waiter stiffen with surprise beside her. However, he nodded obediently and hurried off to deliver the message. She watched closely as the waiter crossed the room, tray held high above his head, to Mr. and Mrs. Clinton. She watched as he whispered into their ears, relaying her message, and she watched her parents freeze. Kendra saw her father angrily snap something at the waiter, causing him to scurry away. The disdain churning inside her towards her parents grew in proportion. How could they be so conceited? Summoning every ounce of courage she possessed, Kendra gritted her teeth and crossed the room with Tim in tow. She stopped before her parents. "Greetings, mother, father," she started. "I see you chased off the messenger that I sent to you." Her mother's icy gaze bore into her, a silent accusation lurking behind her eyes. "And what, pray tell, are you doing at our soiree, Kendra?" she demanded. "Who let you in?" Kendra ignored her mother's hostile tone, her gaze steady as she turned to face her father. "I'm here to introduce my fiancé," she declared, her voice ringing with quiet determination. "The man I want to marry." Her father's brow furrowed in disbelief, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for prying eyes. "Here? Now?" he muttered, his voice tinged with apprehension. "Did anybody see you walk in?" Undeterred by her parents' skepticism, Kendra pressed on. "Yes, here and now," she affirmed. "And everyone saw me. I am your daughter, am I not?" Kendra did not miss the look of doubt that crossed her parents' faces, but at this point, she was past caring. With a confident smile, Tim stepped forward, extending his hand towards Kendra's father in a gesture of greeting. "Tim Steinberg, at your service," he announced with a smile wide enough to charm her father. "A data scientist and investment banker, and delighted to make your acquaintance." Kendra watched her parents closely, her heart pounding in her chest as she waited for their reaction. She could see the flicker of uncertainty in their eyes, the subtle shift in their demeanor as they began to fall for the ruse. And in that moment, she knew that her plan was working. "Tim Steinberg," her father repeated. I am not sure I have heard that name. Perhaps you could tell me more about your name and what you do. Mr. Clinton began to lead Tim towards another corner of the room. Tim turned to Kendra, giving her an "I got this" look, before letting himself be dragged away. "So," Mrs. Clinton exclaimed, "you finally did it, daughter." Kendra turned to her mother. "I did, just like you wanted." Crossing arms over her chest, the older woman continued, "I suppose you're still a pediatric nurse, then?" "I am." Her mother shrugged. "I do not mind. As long as you have an influential husband, it would cover up the rest of your mistakes. It certainly did that for me when I married your father." Kendra felt her skin bristle at the force of her mother's cruel words. She longed to quip back a nasty reply, but reminded herself of why she was here. Before she could say a word, her mother continued, "All in all, I can see you're doing something better with your life than getting married for love. I will speak with your father, make him relinquish his hold on a part of your trust funds. Perhaps, if you see what we can do for you, you'd be a little more grateful to us next time." Mrs. Clinton paused, staring at Kendra pointedly. Kendra, on the other hand, was so consumed by anger that she didn't notice her mother stop. Slapping a plastic smile on her face, she mumbled, "Thanks, Mum." "Good." Her mother raised a champagne flute in salute. "Enjoy the rest of the party, Kendra." Kendra's heart pounded with anticipation as she dumped the bag of money onto Dr. Turner's desk, the weight of it causing a soft thud to echo in the room. The doctor looked up from his paperwork. "What's all this about, Kendra?" Kendra took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she gestured to Tim to take a seat beside her. With determination in her voice, she began to speak. "I've managed to gather $200,000, Kendra announced. "That should be enough to cover McKay's treatment, should it not?" Dr. Turner's eyes widened in disbelief, his mouth falling open slightly. $200,000? Where on earth did you get that kind of money? He asked, his voice tinged with incredulity. The doctor leaned forward on his seat, eyeing Kendra with suspicion. "Kendra, the last time we spoke, you were begging me for another loan. Where did you get this amount of money?" Kendra met the doctor's gaze squarely. "My parents are Mr. and Mrs. Clinton, Dr. Turner. I am a trust fund baby." She leaned forward, her eyes boring into Dr. Turner's with unwavering intensity. "Like I said, I want you to begin the best treatment for McKay immediately. Money is no object, because I have it now. I'll do whatever it takes to save him." When the doctor did not reply, Kendra asked again, "Dr. Turner, what must be done to save my boyfriend?" "A colectomy," the doctor began finally, his tone grave, "which is the removal of the colon, is the best solution to save McKay now." Kendra's heart fluttered at the seriousness of the situation. "And how much does that cost?" she asked. "Name it." The doctor sighed, his expression sympathetic. "About $25,000 tops," he replied. "Plus other expenses, of course." Kendra's mind raced as she calculated the funds she had brought. $200,000 would definitely pay for McKay's surgery, with a huge chunk left for other expenses. Without hesitation, she made her decision. "Take out the money needed for the surgery from what I've provided," she instructed, her voice firm, "and use the rest to pay off my loan." Dr. Turner nodded solemnly. "I'll make the necessary arrangements," he assured her. "Thank you." Kendra turned to Tim, who had been silent during the entire exchange, and jerked her head towards the door. "Come on, Tim." Together they stepped out of the office into the cool evening air. Tim turned to Kendra with a smile on his face. "Phew, that went by very fast." "It did," Kendra said with a chuckle. "I feel relieved, actually. I am so glad that McKay is finally getting the help he needs. Who would have thought that my parents would be of help in the end?" "Who indeed?" Tim agreed, admiration shining in his eyes. "You're a very brave woman, Kendra. Kendra smiled gratefully, even though the weight of the day's events was still heavy on her shoulders. "Thank you," she replied softly. "But McKay, he's the real hero in all of this." Tim's brow furrowed in confusion. "McKay? How so?" Kendra's smile turned nostalgic as she recalled the countless times McKay had been her rock, supporting her through the toughest moments of her journey as a nursing student and later as a pediatric nurse. "When I was at my lowest emotionally and financially, McKay was the only one who stood by me," she explained. "He helped me pick up the pieces and keep going. Now it's my turn to help him." Tim nodded understandingly. "McKay's lucky to have you, and I hope he gets out of this on both feet, safely." Kendra gave him a grateful smile, touched by his words. "Thank you, Tim." Tim offered her a small, grateful smile before turning to walk away. Kendra watched him go, and the sight of his hunched shoulders and wavy salt and pepper hair gave her a bitter taste in her mouth. She turned and walked down the other end of the corridor towards McKay's room. Stopping before the door, she slowly opened it, peeking inside to see her boyfriend toying with a remote. The soft blue glow of a television illuminated the dark room. "Hey!" she called out softly. McKay turned to the door and she saw him smile, even in the dimness of the room. "Baby," he murmured. "Come on in." Kendra stepped inside, closing the door behind her quietly. She took quick strides to his bed and settled on the chair beside it that had become so familiar to her touch. "How have you been, Kendra?" McKay asked. "You look tired to death." "I always am well, my love." She gripped his hand, planting a kiss on his knuckles. McKay reached out and turned on the lamp by his bedside, filling the entire room with bright yellow light. "What about the money for my chemo?" he asked. Kendra could tell by the hesitant tone of his voice that he didn't want to. "I have good news, McKay," she replied, beaming. "I got some money from my parents. You're getting a colectomy now. Dr. Turner said after your colectomy you'd be well again." McKay smiled hesitantly at first, then stared at her with disbelief etched in his blue eyes. "You're kidding, right?" "I'm not." He burst out in laughter. "Oh my God, Kendra, this is wonderful." "I know," Kendra replied, reaching out to press kisses on his forehead. As she pulled back, she saw a glow of genuine joy in McKay's blue eyes that reminded her of one she'd seen in a similar pair only the day before. For some reason, it reminded her too much of Tim. Her smile faded for a moment, and McKay's did too. "What's wrong, baby?" he asked. For a split second, Kendra contemplated telling him about Tim. However, she quickly decided against it. "Nothing. It's nothing," she whispered. Having McKay happy again was the only thing that mattered in that moment. "He will be fine," Mira whispered. "I need you to calm down, Kendra." Kendra sighed and cradled her head in her hands. "It's been weeks, Mira. He still hasn't opened his eyes, and those blasted doctors aren't telling me anything." Mira stared at her friend with eyes full of sympathy. "That's probably because they know how you'd react. McKay will be fine, you'll see. Dr. Turner told us the colectomy was successful, so we need to hold on to that for his sake. All of your troubles cannot be for nothing, can it?" Kendra sighed and gave her friend a small smile. "Yeah, you're probably right. Thank you, Mira." She was cut short by a loud knock on the door, and she stood to her feet to open it. Irene stood on the other side of the doorway, a curious look on her face. "Who's in the office with you?" she asked, craning her abnormally long neck. Kendra felt a growing sliver of annoyance inside her, but managed to tamp it down. "What do you want, Irene?" she asked. Irene's look of curiosity collapsed into a bitter scowl. "It's your boyfriend." Kendra froze. Irene waved her hand airily. "He is in recovery room 12 in case you want to see him, or perhaps you should see Dr. Kendra and Mira pushed past Irene without waiting for the other woman to finish her sentence. They raced down the corridor and towards McKay's recovery room. She skidded to a stop in front of the door and paused, hand hovering over the doorknob. When she heard the soft beep-beep of several monitors, she felt slightly relieved.
She twisted the doorknob and opened the door, stepping inside. The entire room was bathed in bright white light, and McKay lay on the bed, his eyes on the opposite wall.
He turned his head the moment she walked in, and a shaky smile materialized on his face. "Babe," he called out. "I was wondering when you'd stop by." Kendra felt a rush of emotion as she witnessed her boyfriend sit up, still smiling at her. Suddenly, she felt boneless and bereft. A tear slipped from one eye and then the other. "Oh, McKay!" she wailed. "You're alive!" "I think so," McKay joked. Kendra crossed the room on legs that felt like sticks of uncooked pasta. She gingerly sat on his bed, her eyes roaming over his entire body hungrily. She had never felt this kind of wave of happiness in a while. "Are you truly fine?" she asked, in between sniffs, touching his head, his hands, his chest. "Do you feel any pain?" "I am fine, Kay," McKay responded. "I promise I won't die without your permission." Kendra snorted in laughter and wrapped her arms around his neck. "You're really fine. I'm so happy, baby." "I'll leave you guys to it," Mira called out. "Kendra, I'll be in your office. McKay, I'm so happy for you." "Thank you, Mira." Kendra waved to her friend as she left. Soon she was all alone in the room with her boyfriend. "We need to talk, Kendra," McKay started, his face hard and serious. Kendra felt her joy deflate a little. "What is it?" McKay stared long and hard at her with those blue eyes that reminded her so much of Tim before speaking again. "I still do not know how you got the money for my colectomy." Kendra sighed. "It is nothing. You don't need to worry about it, honestly." "No, I think I do." McKay cut in. "You told me your parents gave you the money, but you and I know the kind of relationship you have with them. I know for a fact that they hate me, and my having cancer would not move them to help me. If anything, they'd be relieved that I'd finally be dead and out of the picture. What did you do, Kendra? What did you tell them?" Kendra's lips trembled as she spoke. "Well, it is a long story." McKay gave her hand a reassuring pat. "I'm all ears." "Well, like you said, my parents would rather you die than give me the money for your surgery. So I had to be smart." Kendra watched her boyfriend swallow hard, his eyes unbelievably blank and devoid of emotion. The fear in her heart grew. She'd been hoping for a form of reaction from him, and seeing nothing only made her even more worried. "And where is this Tim man?" he asked. "We parted ways shortly after. He is currently looking for his long-lost wife and son." A few minutes passed, and Kendra stayed put by McKay's bedside, watching him sleep peacefully. The rhythmic rise and fall of his chest was a comforting sight. It was like a hope that she clung to, that the love of her life was still alive and well. She had finally confessed the truth about the source of the money for his surgery, and while McKay seemed understanding, she couldn't shake off the adamant fear of how it might affect their relationship. As McKay's breathing steadied into the rhythm of deep slumber, Kendra quietly rose from her chair, careful not to disturb him. With a final glance at his peaceful form, she stepped out into the hospital corridor. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital hallway greeted her, casting shadows that seemed to dance in the corners. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the wave after wave of thoughts in her mind, when a familiar voice broke through her reverie. "Kendra?" She turned to see Tim approaching, with a smile on his face and a bouquet of flowers in his hand. Despite the gravity of the situation, Kendra couldn't help but feel a pang of relief at the sight of him. She had no idea how the man always managed to disappear and reappear at the perfect time. "Tim!" Kendra greeted him with a tired smile. "I didn't expect to see you here." Tim returned her smile. "How is he?" Kendra's heart warmed at Tim's concern for McKay. She gestured towards the door behind her. "He's asleep right now. It's been a long day for him." Tim nodded understandingly. Do you think I could probably see him later? Kendra hesitated, unsure of how McKay would react to seeing Tim, especially after what she had told her boyfriend. I think that would be nice, Kendra replied finally, but maybe not right now. He needs his rest. Tim nodded in agreement. Of course, I'll come back later then. He smiled at her again, and Kendra could not shake off the feeling of familiarity that descended on her. There was definitely something about McKay in the crinkle of Tim's eyes when he smiled, in the way his brows shot up, and the way his shoulders hunched up when he walked. Despite the weight of her own troubles, she couldn't ignore the sadness etched into Tim's features. She couldn't bear the thought of him continuing his search for his son and wife alone, with no one to offer support or assistance. "Tim, wait!" Kendra called out. Tim paused and turned back to her. Kendra took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she was about to say. "I know I can't repay you for everything you've done for me," she began, her words slow and measured. "But I want to help you find your son and wife in any way that I possibly can." A flicker of hope crossed Tim's face, but it was quickly replaced by resignation. It's been years since they disappeared, and there's been no sign of them. At this point, I think I have given up on the search myself. "No, don't give up." Kendra stepped closer to Tim, determination burning in her eyes. "I won't give up that easily. If there's even a chance of finding them, I want to try." Tim regarded her with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "You would do that for me?" Kendra nodded firmly. "Of course. You've been there for me when I needed it most. Now it's my turn to be there for you." "Well, if you insist." With a small smile, Tim reached into his brown trench coat and pulled out an old, faded photograph. It had been folded several times, the creases worn with age. He handed it to Kendra, his gaze lingering on the image captured within. "This is the only picture I have of them," Tim explained quietly. "My wife and son. If you ever come across anyone who even remotely resembles them, please give me a call. The number is written on the back." Kendra took the photograph gently, her heart swelling with ache. She studied the faces in the picture, committing them to memory. She couldn't imagine the pain Tim must have endured, not knowing the fate of his loved ones. With a final smile, Tim bid her goodbye and turned to leave, disappearing into the bustling corridors of the hospital. Kendra watched him go, her mind buzzing with unanswered questions. Again, she glanced down at the picture, studying the face of the woman. Even though a crease line ran down the woman's face, Kendra could still make out her features. Blonde hair, a familiar-looking wide nose, and beautiful green eyes. The woman in the picture sat behind a kitchen island, smiling widely at the camera. Kendra's eyes moved to the boy who sat beside the woman. His fingers were wrapped around a stub of crayon, and several coloring books were strewn across the top of the island. The boy had his head bent, auburn hair falling along his face. Kendra could not see much of his face, but she spotted a large birthmark that spread along his neck. When she realized where she had seen it before, her hands trembled as the truth came crashing down on Kendra. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a warm golden glow across the city streets as Kendra navigated her car through the familiar maze of New York traffic. McKay sat beside her, his gaze drifting out the window as the buildings blurred past. It had been weeks since he was discharged, almost a month since Kendra had last seen Tim, and finally, they were going to meet again. "So, Kendra?" McKay finally broke the silence, his voice tinged with curiosity. "Do you mind telling me where we're headed?" Kendra glanced at him with a smile playing on her lips. "We're going to meet someone special, that's all." McKay arched an eyebrow, intrigued. "Someone special? Who?" Kendra's smile widened as she turned her attention back to the road. "Remember Tim, the man who helped us with the money for your surgery?" Recognition flickered in McKay's eyes. Of course. Did you find his family or something? Kendra nodded, a sense of satisfaction warming her chest. You won't believe it, but I found them the very same day you woke up after your surgery. McKay's eyes widened in surprise. Really? How did you do that? Why didn't you tell me? I wanted it to be a surprise, Kendra admitted, and I wanted to make sure everything was in place before I brought it up. It's a special moment after all. A smile spread across McKay's face, lighting up his features. That's amazing, Kendra. I can't wait to see the look of excitement on Tim's face when he finally reunites with his family. In that moment, Kendra felt a surge of emotion welling up inside her. She was tempted to tell McKay the truth, but something held her back. She wanted it to be a shared moment. Instead, she forced a smile and kept her gaze fixed on the road ahead. It's going to be a special moment indeed. They drove in silence for a while, even though Kendra knew her boyfriend was almost bursting apart with questions. In a matter of minutes, she pulled into the parking lot of the quaint cafe where she'd agreed to meet with Tim. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the air as she parked the car and turned off the ignition. She reached for her phone and the worn photograph, flipping it over to reveal the number scrawled on the back. With a steady hand, she dialed the digits and brought the phone to her ear. Tim answered on the second ring, his familiar voice filling her ears. Hello? Tim, it's Kendra, she said, her voice tinged with excitement. We're here. Are you already inside? There was a moment of silence on the other end before Tim's voice came through, slightly muffled but filled with warmth. Yes, I'm sitting at booth 4. I cannot wait to see you both. Kendra smiled, her heart swelling with anticipation. We'll be there in just a moment. As she ended the call, Kendra turned to McKay, who was watching her with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Tim's waiting for us inside. McKay furrowed his brow, his gaze searching Kendra's face for answers. What is all of this really about, babe? Kendra met McKay's gaze with a reassuring smile, squeezing his hand gently. Trust me, McKay. Just trust me. Together, the both of them stepped out of the car and made their way towards the entrance of the cafe. Kendra craned her neck in search of Tim's familiar, hunched figure as they walked in, and finally their eyes met from opposite ends of the cafe. Tim's eyes lit up with excitement as he spotted Kendra, a warm smile spreading across his face. Hello, she called out as they reached him. Kendra slipped behind the booth, and McKay silently followed her. Hello, Kendra, Tim answered, grinning. It's quite good to see you. Likewise. Kendra glanced at her boyfriend, who appeared lost. Tim, this is McKay. McKay, Tim. Good morning, Tim, McKay said, stretching out his hand for a shake. Thank you so much for the help. I heard about what you did for me. Tim waved his hand in a dismissive gesture. Oh, it's nothing. Kendra helped me as well, so it only makes sense that I return the favor. When they were settled, Tim turned to Kendra. So, where's my family? Tim's voice trembled with anticipation, his eyes searching hers for answers. When are they getting here? Kendra took a deep breath, steeling herself for the moment she had been dreading. Tim, your family is right here. Tim's brow furrowed in confusion, his gaze darting between Kendra and McKay. What do you mean? With a sense of resolve, Kendra found McKay's hand under the table. Tim, meet McKay, your son. Tim's eyes widened in shock as he took in McKay's familiar features. Even now, the resemblance between father and son is becoming unmistakable. My son? Kendra nodded, her throat going dry. I guessed all along, Tim. There was something about you that reminded me of McKay. But the day I finally knew was the day you gave me the picture of your wife and son. The realization dawned on Tim, his eyes brimming with emotion as he struggled to comprehend the truth. I can't believe this. You're my son? Kendra reached into her bag and pulled out the folded photograph, placing it gently on the table before Tim. Take a look, Tim. Do you recognize this? Tim's hands shook slightly as he picked up the photograph, his gaze lingering on the image of his wife and son. I gave you this. Kendra nodded, her heart aching with sympathy for Tim's pain. And do you see the birthmark on your son's neck? Tim examined the photograph closely, his breath catching in his throat as he spotted the distinctive mark. Yes, I see it. Kendra turned to McKay, her eyes brimming with emotion. Show him yours, McKay. With a sense of reverence, McKay lifted his hand to his neck, pulling down his collar to reveal the birthmark that matched the one in the photograph. Tim's eyes widened in disbelief, his breath catching in his throat as he reached out to touch it, as if confirming that it was real. I can't believe this. Tim's voice was barely a whisper, his eyes shimmering with unshed tears. You're my son. McKay's gaze softened with compassion as he reached out to clasp Tim's hand. Hello, Dad. Tears welled up in Kendra's eyes as she watched the reunion unfold before her, a moment of profound connection and healing. Tears gathered in Tim's eyes as he held on to McKay's hands like a buoy. God, I never thought I'd see you ever again. Oh, Dad, McKay whispered, an aching look in his eyes. Mom never told me anything about you until she died. The smile faded from Tim's face. Elaine is dead? Yes, McKay nodded. She died when I was in high school. Tim's face contorted in pain, and he lowered his head, shedding silent tears. Kendra knew that this was her cue to leave the family to their reunion. Silently, Kendra stood from the booth and walked away. As she got to the door, she turned to the father and son and caught them sharing tears over the table. Her heart swelled with joy. It was absolutely perfect. Outside, the crisp air bit at Kendra's cheeks, a stark contrast to the warmth of the diner she had just exited. Her eyes were glossy, reflecting the poignant scene she had witnessed, a scene rich with emotion and years of unspoken words finally shared. As she stepped away, her hand instinctively rested on her belly, a gentle touch to the new life burgeoning within her. A life that was her very own secret, one she wasn't ready to share just yet. Her heart thrummed with a symphony of emotions. Pride for having orchestrated this reunion. Relief that it had unfolded better than she could have hoped. And above all, a profound sense of accomplishment. She had changed lives today, had mended broken pieces of a past long shattered. This was her moment, the quiet after the storm, the peace after the chaos. Here, she allowed herself a small, knowing smile. Yes, this was a victory, a sweet one at that, and the thrill of it washed over her, invigorating and gentle all at once.